Hello and welcome back to the SecurityMetrics podcast. My name is Jen Stone. I'm one of the principal security analysts here at SecurityMetrics. We have a ton of topics out there now for you to listen to on the podcast. If this is your first one, welcome. Go check out the back catalog. If you are a returning listener, thank you so much. We really appreciate having you here. This is the reason I get to keep talking to interesting people. And speaking of interesting people and interesting topics, last episode we talked about artificial intelligence, and it's a very compelling topic. People are very concerned and interested, and there's a lot to it right now. And I thought, man, we should have somebody else come back and talk more about it. And so today I have Paul Starrett with me today. Paul, please let people know about yourself.
Hello, and thank you, Jen, for having me on the podcast today. Yes, I do want to just very briefly give a shout out to that last podcast. I listened to it. It's a fabulous listen.
Thank you.
It gives a perspective I have not heard yet.
Yeah, Willie was terrific, and I really appreciated his time coming on and talking to us.
Absolutely. I've actually chatted with him, but we don't want to digress down that at this point. But I think people get a real enjoyment out of that podcast. It's very easy to listen to and very informative. With that said, my name is Paul Starrett. You got this pronunciation correct.
Thank you.
Yes. It's sort of a long and circuitous history, but I'll avoid the irrelevant parts. As I sit here, I'm an attorney. I consider myself a data scientist and more of a technologist, to be honest. I came up in the world. I started in law enforcement. Found early on that was not for me. I went into the private sector and then eventually went into information security programming. Worked for RSA Security as a C programmer. And then as time went along, I went to law school at night to be a better engineer. I was more to learn rather than to practice it.
That's awesome.
Formally. Yeah. So anyway, fast forward, 2013 is when I officially got into the area of data science and law. I've been immersed in it ever since then. So it's not new to me, especially LLMs. I've been learning about them since 2019. But
now you used a term that people might not be familiar with.
Yes, large language model.
Okay, thank you.
And others might know it as ChatGPT.
Mm-hmm.
GPT stands for generative. I'm going to forget here now and embarrass myself.
Is it predictive text? Generative predictive text?
Generative predictive transformer.
Okay, so I don't even know. We all know I think we've all heard of GPT, and it's one of those things where like, oh, GPT, it's just as its initials. We don't know.
Yes. I normally can roll that off the top of my head, but for some reason this morning I've got to consume more coffee here. But an LLM is a transformer, basically.
Okay.
And so we won't have to get into the hood on that too much, unless you'd like to.
I mean, anytime we use some sort of abbreviation or jargon or a term that some people might have familiarity with and other people might not, we want to make sure that everybody who's listening can come along the ride with us and not feel like, oh, I'm at a disadvantage out the gate. So that's why I stopped you. I did not mean to interrupt the flow of who you are, though. Please continue with that. I think it's a very interesting kind of history and chronology.
Yes, thank you. There's only a few sentences left, actually. So ever since then, I have been general counsel, chief risk officer for a company it was international, publicly traded, that dealt with artificial intelligence and data management for the legal profession. So I started my own firm in 2015, privacylabs.ai, if you want to learn more about me and what I do. But more formally now, I'm also Starrett Law, where there's two firms. So if you want to learn more about me, go to Starrett Law, StarrettLaw.com. And you can learn more about me. But other than that, I do have a master's in data science. I think that's about it. I think that's probably enough.
Well, and since we are talking about AI or artificial intelligence, I think that you should talk a little bit more about how long you have been involved in the AI field, because you have a substantial history there as well.
Yes. So back in 2011, when I started with this company, AI was really starting to kind of come to its first real kind of I don't know what the word is. Kind of like the LLM is now, ChatGPT. It was kind of becoming the thing.
Right.
And that the problem is that it was being oversold because people didn't understand it. I've always said, don't use machine learning or artificial intelligence unless you have a reason. In any event, 2011, I started getting into it, and then in 2013, I was the first chair of the American Bar Association's Big Data Committee. And I really took the plunge at that point. And I was also a member of a few other committees with the ABA that were AI related. I've done a lot of speaking engagements. And so primarily in the, we'll get to this later, I believe, in the area of natural language processing.
Right.
But yeah, and so that I got my master's degree during that time from data science and various other things. But yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah.
So I know a lot of people are kind of putting the lawyer AI governance hat now. And a lot of them are very good people and very qualified, but this is not new for me.
Well, I'm glad that we have you to talk to today, especially since the topic you and I were talking about, what would be the right way to approach this, and you were talking about how artificial intelligence might apply to PCI DSS and other compliance topics, and I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear more about that. I guess starting with let's contextualize it a little bit. What is AI in this context?
Yes, that's a broad question, but I think it's fair to say that there's two basic buckets. The first one is in threat detection and in fraud detection are examples of this, just to contextualize it, is unsupervised machine learning. And what you're basically saying is, I don't necessarily have a historical set of patterns that I can learn from to tell me what is fraudulent or not, or what is classified as, let's just say, low risk, medium risk, high risk. I don't have that. So what you do is you have to decide what is anomalous, what's an outlier, because typically that's where your nefarious activity is. Right. Sometimes those are mistakes, but for the sake of our argument, if someone's trying to breach a system, trying to break through, let's say, a fraud defense AI system, what you look for is these anomalies. That's where you look first. So what the machine learning does is says, well, all this information I have, what's normal? It can do that easily.
Right.
It has that data. And then you look for the outliers. Okay, you start to look there. The other type is called supervised. The first one's unsupervised because you don't have the prior information. The second one's called supervised. And supervised is basically you do have prior information that tells you what a piece of data is. So I'll give you a quick example. I have run I've actually written a program that it's a public data set of fraudulent transactions. It's in a spreadsheet, real simple. It has 21 columns and 285,000 rows. Each row has a field that is fraud or not. Okay, what the machine learning program does is it looks at the fraudulent transactions and the non-fraudulent and says, is there a pattern here? And I say, fraudulent transaction looks like this, and a legitimate one looks like this. Supervised because I have the data and I learn from it. So those are the two basic buckets. There's a thing called reinforcement learning, which rather than making classifying something as fraud or non-fraud, it makes a decision. And LLMs kind of leverage that. So this is called reinforcement learning. It says, if this happens, do this action. It says it makes a decision. So that's kind of tucked in there as well. LLMs also use a thing called self-supervised learning, but we don't have to do that. That is a bucket unto its own.
Okay.
So I think that's a good way to a good foundation to build from here.
Sure. And the what you're talking about is some people might be familiar with the phrase indicators of compromise, or IOCs. And these indicators of compromise are what often tell our security tools that something is wrong. There's a pattern there, either a pattern that we're unfamiliar with, that could be an indicator of compromise, or a pattern that we know is an indicator of compromise. Would that be like the unsupervised versus the supervised approach?
Yes, that's a great way to put that into a more of a digestible framework. That's exactly right. Very often, one thing that hackers or nefarious actors have is they change what they do.
Yeah.
So the supervised machine learning they call it training data, is going to change. So with this unsupervised, with this ability to look for anomalies, you can have this sort of sliding context, especially like seasonal activity. The buying is greater around the seasons, right? In Christmas and in the festivities around that time. So it can accommodate that's what's nice about unsupervised learning, is that you can find whatever's normal yesterday is not normal today. And so, yes, but that's a great way of putting that.
And so finding these potential fraud indicators, I think, is really important in organizations that are dealing with transactions and want to make sure that transactions are supposed to be going through. One of the times that I had this happen to me personally is as a QSA, I travel a lot for my regular job, going around literally around the world and looking at systems and talking to people. So sometimes I'll be in one country and thinking about another one. So I happened to be in Singapore, and I was looking at my next, in 2 weeks I was going to be in New Zealand, and I wanted to get tickets for some special thing at a zoo there. So here I was using my American Express while in Singapore to buy tickets to this thing in New Zealand, and American Express said, no, that just feels sketchy. And so I had to, call them and say that, yes, that is a pattern that you would have flagged as sketchy, but it is actually something I'm doing. And so I think a lot of us are familiar. If we travel, sometimes if you go, maybe just, drive up to Canada, and all of a sudden, why isn't my credit card working? Well, you haven't told the company that you're going to be there, and so they're concerned that maybe this is out of pattern for you. And it feels like recognizing patterns like this is a great way to use AI.
It really is. And you touch on something that, now, a lot of times these systems are based on what's called rule-based, RULE-based. It's not machine learning of the two variants we discussed. It's just basic if then else. Now, ultimately, that is what AI will do, make a decision, but it's more based on statistical metrics. But with whatever the case is, you're right. That's exactly the point. I do want to make one more point to kind of set the stage here very briefly, is that data, they had used the term big data back in the day. Not a good term, I don't think. But it talks about data that is 3 V's: volume, large; voracious, meaning lots of different types; and velocity, fast moving.
Okay.
The only way to manage your data is with machine learning. That is the only way to keep up and also to stay compliant. So machine learning has really become part of the backbone of modern enterprises, even down to the SMB, small, medium business. So that's why this has become such an issue. Also, the way that sometimes these people defeat these models is to change the columns. They change the information and see what slips under the radar. They have a copy of the model. They're able to test it and see how can they. It's like pen testing a model.
Basically fooling it, right?
Yeah, exactly. But that's maybe something we will touch on a little bit later here.
Okay, so when AI started being a big buzzword, 10, 15 years ago, there was a big argument about whether something was artificial intelligence or machine learning. And it was one of the big debates of the day, whether you should use one language, term or another. Do you have an opinion on what is the difference between machine learning and AI, or was that just something else people wanted to argue about?
You mean between the term artificial intelligence and machine learning? Yeah, no, that's a good question. For all intents and purposes, artificial intelligence does not have to mean machine learning. So the rule-based thing I mentioned, in a way, that's artificial intelligence, right? There are other things escapes me, but I think for all intents and purposes, they're interchangeable.
Okay, great.
I don't pretend to like the term artificial intelligence myself. Machine learning tells you exactly what you're talking about.
But there's different types of machine learning, right?
Yes, unsupervised, supervised. There's a whole bunch of things. Semi-supervised, reinforcement learning, self-supervised. There's neural networks, deep learning. Some people argue that is its own little category under machine learning. I think it's maybe so, but I don't. And then within that is generative AI, which is LLMs and ChatGPT.
Okay. So tell me more about, I think we talked a little bit before the call about the 3 buckets of machine learning.
Yep.
That included tabular data and NLP, which was the natural language processing, and then there was a third one. What are those 3 buckets, and how do they differ, and how do we use them?
Yes. So generally speaking, in the real world, they tend to fall into 3 buckets. The first, let me just get one out of the way. It's what's called computer vision, but also image processing. It's sort of the idea that you can. It's really the industry that uses it is the government, federal government, for things like guiding drones, image recognition, right, or driverless cars. So that tends to be owned primarily by big companies. So for those of us that are not in that area, which we are, I think, that's the first bucket. We'll just kind of move out of the way. The two that remaining is tabular data. Tabular, literally, like I mentioned with that fraud transaction, it's just columns and rows. It's like tabs. A tabular-based file or CSV. It's just columns and rows, and each column may have its own data type, a number. It could be text. It could be just anything. And the third one is natural language processing, and each of those are very different in the way that they are approached from a machine learning perspective. So tabular data, what you use, they both use all the types I mentioned, unsupervised, supervised, and so on. So that's still a valid backdrop.
Right.
But NLP, the tabular data, which is where we often find machine learning models that are used in payment card processing for looking at transaction, because a transaction is nothing more than something that fits into a row in a database.
Which means that you can use the tabular data machine learning for that.
That's right. The other variant of that is these things called logs. All of your I'm going to probably go a little bit off topic here, but it is kind of important. All of your software applications, your firewall, your email server, create logs. They generate data saying this happened at this time by this person, and all those logs get sent to a central location to a thing called an SEIM. It's a Security Incident Event Manager.
Yes,
that's tabular data too. So that also becomes a place where we look for nefarious activity, and we can follow the breadcrumbs of a bad actor.
Okay, so I know that this is like a side quest talking about the logs and the SIM, but I think it's really important, especially to this audience, because especially in PCI DSS and especially in some of these other standards of compliance, logs are a really critical way to know if your security is functioning properly or to look for these indicators of compromise.
That's right, because what happens is when a nefarious actor enters your network, for example, they're going to hop around between applications, right?
Right.
They're going to land on a machine, or they're going to change permissions. All of these things go to this log repository or bucket, and you can see where the person goes. You can see how that unfolds, and that gives you a pattern, right?
Absolutely.
It tells you what's normal. So if you look at what the normal activity for a server is, for example, right? Who goes there? When?
Who goes there?
How
Yeah, exactly.
And how they come in and out is normal. Anything else is like, wait a minute. So yes, that's. I think your point is.
And it's a timely conversation as well for that, because PCI DSS 4.0 now says up until 3.2.1, you are allowed to review your logs manually, which is honestly a little bit insane.
It really is.
Who has the ability, even if you have a team of people, to look at your logs manually and find these indicators of compromise? I don't think it's really possible anymore without some machine learning backing that review.
You're preaching to the choir there. There are programs that are fairly robust that are using AI, actually, called an application called Splunk, SPLUNK, Sumo Logic, SUMO Logic. Among others, there's a program called Elastic, but that's, again, getting down a rabbit hole.
And but it's great because Splunk and Sumo Logic and Elastic Cache, those things are for our technical listeners. They're very familiar with these. They're like, I've been using Splunk for years, right? I've been using these are the reasons that I can do my job, or because of these tools. And then people who are on the business side who are listening might say, "Oh, that's why I'm paying for that. That's why because Splunk is pricey, right?"
Yes.
But it's also the reason it's pricey is it has this robust set of tools that give you this information that you really couldn't get in another way. You need these tools in place, using this machine learning, using this AI to give you these indicators of compromise about the patterns that you're seeing in those logs. And that's why it's important.
Yes, and this might be a good chance to briefly just get into the topic of when you are talking about AI governance, which is just governing machine learning models, when you're building it and testing it and you're watching it out in the real world.
Right.
It's all risk-based, and it's this is common sense, but we just have to state it. The risk looks at what are the benefits and what's the cost. How is it, helping you? So Splunk, I think the idea is that if the money I'm spending is a net gain, or Sumo Logic, maybe different.
Right.
I'm a personal fan of Sumo Logic because I go to their events. I'm nothing wrong with Splunk; they're wonderful. Don't get me wrong, but as a company, I really prefer them. I don't work for them. I'm not promulgating.
You just find them compelling and interesting, and you enjoy going and doing the
I'm
things.
here in Silicon Valley, and you make these relationships.
So
yes, so
I lost track a little bit. Were you saying that this is where the tabular data is still really primarily used in those situations? Are we getting?
Yes.
So that's why a lot of us are very familiar with the tabular data approaches.
Mm-hmm.
But now this new thing has come along, the Chat GPT, which is your natural language processing, your NLP model, right? So Chat GPT using the NLP. Why is this different? Why is it now? Why is it all of a sudden everybody's going, hang on, we have concerns, or we're super excited, or we're both things at the same time? Well, what is this? What is the difference with this NLP?
Well, okay, let me just back up just a minute. So yes, just to clarify the tabular data, just real quickly, there are log standards. Microsoft has one, so they fit into something that has the same columns. So that you're looking at apples and apples. So yes, that is tabular data, clearly, and that's the value there. Also, these machine learning models that are looking at transactions as they're coming through real time. But the LLM is different because natural language is different. First of all, what's nice is we're all experts, relatively speaking, in speaking language. We know when something doesn't look right when it's brought through, when it's outputted at ChatGPT, right? So we can make our own judgment on that. Language barriers notwithstanding, the difference though is the permutations. So the way you build an LLM it's a big topic, but just to keep it very simple, you take a whole bunch of data. In the case of some of these commercially available LLMs like ChatGPT, they gathered everything on the internet, right? They just scooped up all this information, and they take that and they grind it through these algorithms that break it down into words and sentences and topics, and they group those together. They take the documents and bring them together into these, different clusters, they call them,
Right.
one way to talk about it. And what happens there is you get this machine learning model. It's supervised. It's actually self-supervised. We don't have time to get into that.
Okay.
The problem is, what's the training data? In the case of the 285,000 rows that I mentioned earlier, it's fixed amount of data. But what happens if you move two words in a sentence other way around? It totally throws off the meaning of that sentence.
Right.
So what are the permutations between the documents and the words and the sentences? It's basically infinite.
Right.
And so you never really know what is the underlying data that's been used. And one of the biggest problems with machine learning is explainability. In order for you to be compliant, this is getting to AI governance, AI law right now. You have to understand how it works, or you don't know what's happening. You can't tell whether it's behaving nefariously. So in the case of LLMs, for example, it spits out junk. It tells you, can a monkey sing? It doesn't know that. It may eventually, but it only knows what it's been taught, and it only knows the only reason so far. Only unless and until we know how the human brain works, which we're decades away from, will these things really be tight. So without getting too far off the topic, or without getting too circuitous here, but the problem is, what is the underlying data that we're working with? It changes all the time. When you ask something of ChatGPT, it's going down and it's looking at all of what it's got, and it's bringing you back an answer. If you push, you can also say, please regenerate that. What it'll do, takes the same prompt, the same question or request, and it gives you back something similar but different. So we don't know what it's doing on the fly like that. There are tools you can use to tell what's happening, just to be clear, that you can tell, okay, here's why it made this decision. So then you can correct for it. Oh, it leaked private information, or it defamed somebody when it shouldn't have, or it gave out trade secret information, or it hallucinated, or it told you how to build a bomb. All these guardrails that they're trying to keep these weaknesses from taking place. So I probably said enough.
Well, there have many questions based on this, what you've just said, and it's starting with this. It scoops up all this information to learn things. Okay, well, what does it scoop up? Is it allowed to scoop up that information? Have people given permission for that information to be scooped up? Here's another way of looking at that. And so that's one big concern, is maybe some privacy issues on what it's gathered. Number two is, what is its sample set? Is it looking at a limited belief system? Is it looking at a limited geographical area? Is it looking at, so people might, in a small geographical area, might have a very different view of how things work than people in another geographical area who are remote and have not communicated with each other. How do we know, first of all, from let's start with a privacy issue, because we know that Zoom almost got itself into a lot of trouble recently by saying it was going to train its models on everything that came through. And people said, what the heck are you talking about? This might be really sensitive information, right? So how do we, from a governance perspective, is there anything in place that puts some guardrails on what a learning model is allowed to collect and look at?
Yes. By the way, there are whole, I'm going to say industries, that's a little bit of a strong word, but there are many startups and many companies that are well into their growth that deal with this. It can tell you whether or not there is private data in your training set, in the data you're building your model with. GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, actually speaks to this. They have guidelines for how to use machine learning models, what private data can be used. I think they use different terms. New AI risk frameworks and laws are in the works, or in the mail even. And so, but there are machine learning methods for telling you whether there's private data that's coming out of a model. Okay, there are companies that do this and they do it very well. There's a little bit of a nuance there. There's a commercial kind of challenge in that the model is most accurate, okay, when you have the private data underneath it. It needs as much information as it can get. It's called a privacy budget.
That was actually going to be my second question, is if you do limit the access to information, are you limiting the functionality and really the veracity of what's coming out of the machine?
That's right. And so let me just back up a minute. And we have to recognize how limitless the responses and the answers that you could get back from the model. It's so broad and deep and unknown. You really have to do very careful engineering of the LLM. Very doable, by the way. There are tools for this. But the idea is that the more you accommodate public policy factors like privacy and sensitive information and what have you, the less accurate the model gets, generally speaking. So there's this inverse relationship that the more I try to make the data less likely to reveal private information, generally the less accurate the model. And so there are even times where the model is no longer worth doing because the risk is so high, it's no longer worth doing. So you just go back to saying, we're not going to use machine learning here. It's just the cost is too high, the risk is too much. But there are machine learning methods for saying, is there private data here? And there's more to it than that. Very briefly, but it's an important thing to say. If the model that I'm training and I'm using is in a very tightly controlled environment, what's the risk that private data is going to find itself where it shouldn't be? It's much lower than if it's out on a web-facing application like Open ChatGPT, right?
Right.
Where anyone can get to it. But if I have a server room and it's locked down, the only people who have access to it we've done background checks on. So you see that the risk isn't just in the model and the privacy, it's also in these peripheral issues, cybersecurity and data protection and so forth.
So again, understanding, and this is something we come back to a lot in in compliance and security is what is the scope that you're looking at? What information are you trying to protect? What systems are you trying to protect, and how are you doing it? And it sounds like you can have a machine learning model that is embedded within that set of systems, where you consider the security of that and the utility of the information you're getting out of it based on that scope as well.
Correct. And we have to remember that LLMs specifically are often very when they're used in the real world, they are focused. So you can have an LLM that builds on top of ChatGPT, for example, or Llama or DALL-E or some of these other ones that are out there that builds on top of it. You have your own data that you're now building your own, for all intents and purposes, your own LLM that is going to be piped through the commercially available one. For, like, say, for example, healthcare. It has its own terms, its own whatever, right? Financial services has its own words, patterns, and so forth. And even within those, you have subtopics, right? So what you're doing is you're looking at that level, generally speaking, with regard to looking at what do I have private data that's being leaked, or is there sensitive information that's coming out? And what's nice is it's a much smaller, field to have to accommodate, because you're now in this much more narrow set of data that you're looking at.
Right, but it also brings up concepts of if you're building on an existing model, what are the chances that you're going to either bring in protected health information, for example, from that model,
Yes.
or that the protected health information that you are trying to work within your model will in some way be released to whatever you're building on top of. So finding ways to make sure that we understand in what direction is the data flowing, I think is critical to this. So do you see people actually developing their own systems of this, or do you really see people using something that maybe a service provider has built for them?
I think it depends on the use case. I think if it's just someone like a marketer who's saying, give me an article on, how to market a law firm, it'll do that. It'll tell you up until 2021, because it doesn't have any information beyond 2021. That's a risk, by the way.
Yeah.
At least currently, as we speak here in August.
Right.
It is August, yes, 2023. But I think when you start getting into these verticals, these regulations that are coming out, we'll say, hey, look, you'd better stay on top of this stuff. So I think it's really going to be at the level where you're building your own LLM, your own retrieval mechanism on top of it. It's a very complex topic, and testing it. What you have to do is you kind of what in AI governance we do a thing called adversarial robustness testing, ART. And with that, what we do is we take the model. We're in our own little secure environment. Is this purely sandbox testing, right? We're not, and we say, well, let's throw some things at it and see what it does, and look at what comes back. And you can automate this sometimes, but this is the way you say, well, if I were to, and it's very, very specific. I can't give you some. There are tools out there that help you do this for specific verticals. Okay, but you need subject matter experts, domain experts who can say that's wrong, right? So it's this process of training the model and testing it and giving it variations of inputs to see what it spits back. And there are tools for this, by the way. This is a doable, responsible thing that you can actually approach. It's not this wild west. But that's what you have to do. Is you kind of have to. And that's one thing that my team works with, is this very thing, where we can test the model to see how robust it is, to see, is it doing the wrong thing? Is it giving you hallucinations like a monkey that plays the piano?
So this tuning and testing of the model, what kind of risk is there related to maybe bias introduced by the subject matter experts?
It's very concerning, because bias can be inserted anywhere along that path. The person who collects the data may not understand that it may be inherently biased. The person who's training the model may not recognize that what's coming back is a bias. And so there's various types of bias, but yes, this is probably legally one of the biggest areas of risk, is that you are inserting bias into things like criminal recidivism. Will this person reoffend? Well, you don't want to give one person more, for example, in determining what their sentence should be.
Oh,
they look,
okay.
okay, right? What should this person be sentenced to? Well, I don't want to add a year to their sentence erroneously. That certain class of our society is being more impacted than the other one simply because of the bias. So that's horrific to put someone in jail for more time than they should have or less time. And there are other examples where hiring and firing, or that probably wouldn't be the case, but the decision to interview a candidate.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Right. So are you somehow taking, gender bias or cultural or religious bias unknowingly? You're looking at people. It could be entirely innocent inadvertent, but that's the result. That you're choosing who to hire. These are very fundamental questions, and that's why they are so much a part of our legislative, and legal, environment.
So you do you see legislation coming through that is trying to make sure that there is a protection against that kind of bias in these models?
Yes. And it applies to all models. We should be clear that this can happen in tabular data, in computer vision. These speak to the full horizontal area, right? But it tends to come up more in natural language processing. Yes, there's a thing that the National Institutes of Standards and Technology,
right? NIST is very familiar to a lot of listeners.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yes, so they have a standard called it's a responsible AI. If you Google that, the number that it has escapes me as we sit here, but they have one. It's out there now.
Okay.
To my knowledge, here in August 2023, there are no regulations that are squarely devoted to this topic. There's also the IAPP, the information.
It's a privacy thing, right?
Professionals. The International Association of Privacy Professionals.
People are out there going, Jen, you should know this, and yes, I should.
Yes. It's early morning here, and I was swimming last night, and it kept me up. Anyway, so they have an AI governance certificate now.
Oh.
And also, let's just say that there are many things coming out. China has a law coming out, and then I'm sure I'm missing something here. But yes, there are things out there. There's another one that I wanted to. ISO has a standard that's come out that Willie, your privacy, actually was part of.
Okay.
So yeah, they are definitely things. They all say basically the same thing, if I'm being honest. They have to, because the way you build a model is a science. And so the way you build it, you have to follow certain rules. And, I will leave you with one thing that I think is underrepresented. There's a thing called the cross industry standard for data mining, CRISP-DM, CRISP-DM. Look that up. That standard is, when I took my master's program in data science at Northwestern, all of my assignments had to track that sequential process to prove I had done it properly. You'll find that these frameworks and these laws will follow that same reasoning.
Oh, excellent.
So if you look at CRISP-DM, you'll see this embodied. It's a great way to learn very quickly how to govern models.
All right. Well, so we've talked a lot about risks. We've talked about, potential concerns, potential biases, but I want to leave people with a kind of a positive note. Is there anything kind of exciting in AI? Is there something that really gets you, what drives you to continue being part of this world?
Well, that's the thing. It's kind of like driving a car. What would your life be without the car or your phone? Probably not so much with your phone, but when you drive your car on the road, you run the risk you might run out of gas somewhere in the middle of nowhere, or you might get hit by another car. So it's a net gain. It is an enabler. Machine learning is here to really move us to the next level and how to leverage it. We just have to understand that it's like everything else. It has risks that have to be accommodated. And you just apply a risk-based analysis. You compare the costs and the benefits. It's really what it boils down to. So I kind of feel that's, I'm very optimistic, or I wouldn't be in this. I'm here to help marshal it forward to make sure that it's between the guardrails, as it were, and helping people do that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that view of it, because so often we can get wrapped up in, it's a new thing and it's terrifying, and which partially it kind of is, concerning. But but knowing that also there are so many positive benefits out of it, and there are so many good ways that we could use it. Just being aware of the risks and moving forward to with a way that mitigates them so that we can maximize the positive things. Really appreciate that view that you've given us.
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you for talking to us today, and I hope to talk to you again in the near future, Paul.
All right, thank you, Jen, for having me on. It was a pleasure.
All right, bye-bye. Thanks for watching. To watch more episodes of Security Metrics Podcast, click on the box on the left. If you prefer to listen to this podcast, it's available on all your favorite podcast platforms. See you on the slopes.